Good evening, and welcome back to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and we continue The Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. This is part 28, and the opening of Book 6. When we left Book 5, Titus had thrown his great wall of circumvallation right round Jerusalem, sealing the city in, and within those walls the famine had begun to do what the legions could not. Now the misery grows worse by the day, and the war narrows to a single dreadful object, the Tower of Antonia, the fortress that overlooks the temple. Titus mines its foundations and rouses his men with a stirring speech on courage and the contempt of death, and a Bithynian centurion named Julian gives us one of the most extraordinary feats of arms in the whole book. Let us begin.
The misery in Jerusalem grew worse every day. The seditious became even more hardened by the disasters around them, although the famine had already consumed the common people and was now consuming them as well. The heaps of bodies piled one upon another were a terrible sight, and they gave off a deadly stench that made it harder for anyone to make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy. Yet those who went out in battle order were men already accustomed to countless murders, and they had to march over the dead bodies as they advanced. They were not frightened, and they felt no pity for the men they trampled underfoot. Nor did they think that this insult to the dead was an evil omen for themselves. Their right hands were already stained with the blood of their own countrymen, and in that condition they ran out to fight foreigners. To me, they seemed to be reproaching God himself, as though he were too slow in punishing them. The war was no longer being carried on as if they had any hope of victory. Instead, in a brutish way, they gloried in the very despair into which they had fallen. Meanwhile, the Romans, though they had great difficulty gathering materials, finished their banks in 21 days. They had cut down all the trees in the country adjoining the city, for 90 furlongs around, as I have already related. The sight of the country itself was deeply mournful. Places that had once been adorned with trees and pleasant gardens had become desolate in every direction, with all their trees cut down. No foreigner who had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and then saw them turned into a desert, could have failed to lament and mourn bitterly over so great a change. The war had completely destroyed every sign of beauty. If anyone who had known the place before had suddenly come to it now, he would not have recognized it. Even if he were standing at the city itself, he still would have asked where it was. When the banks were completed, they became a cause of fear both to the Romans and to the Jews. The Jews expected that the city would be taken unless they could burn those banks, while the Romans expected that, if the banks were burned, they would never be able to take the city. There was a severe shortage of materials, and the soldiers' bodies were beginning to fail under such hard labor, just as their spirits were weakened by so many failures. Indeed, the calamities inside the city discouraged the Romans more than they discouraged those within it. The Romans saw that the fighting men among the Jews were not softened at all by such dreadful afflictions. At the same time, the Romans themselves had less and less hope of success. Their banks had given way to the enemy's stratagems, their engines had been resisted by the strength of the wall, and their close fighting had been met by the boldness of the Jewish attacks. What discouraged them most of all was that the Jews' courage seemed greater than the many miseries they were suffering from sedition, famine, and the war itself. The Romans were almost ready to imagine that the violence of the Jews' assaults could not be overcome, and that the eagerness they showed could not be broken by calamity. For they thought, what would men like these not be able to endure if fortune favored them, when they turned even their misfortunes into an increase of valor? These considerations made the Romans keep a stronger guard around their banks than they had before. John and his party now took measures to secure themselves in case this wall should be thrown down, and they began their work before the battering rams were brought against them. Yet they did not accomplish what they were trying to do. They went out with their torches, but came back greatly discouraged before they even reached the banks. The reasons were these. First, their action did not seem united. They went out in separate parties, at separate intervals, slowly and fearfully, in short, without Jewish courage. They were now lacking what is characteristic of our nation: boldness, violent attack, rushing all together upon the enemy and persisting in the attempt even if it does not at first succeed. Instead, they went out more weakly than usual. At the same time, they found the Romans drawn up in order and more courageous than ordinary. The Romans guarded their banks with their bodies, and with all their armor so completely on every side that they left no space for fire to get in among them. Every man was so resolute that he would rather die than abandon his rank. Besides their belief that all their hopes would be cut off if these works were burned, the soldiers were deeply ashamed at the thought that craft might entirely overcome courage, madness overcome armor, numbers overcome skill, and Jews overcome Romans. The Romans also had another advantage. Their siege engines helped them by throwing darts and stones at the Jews as they came out of the city. A man who fell became an obstacle to the man next to him, and the danger of advancing farther made the rest less eager in their attempts. Some of those who had run under the darts were frightened by the good order and close ranks of the enemy before they ever came to hand-to-hand fighting. Others were struck by spears and turned back again. At last they began reproaching one another for cowardice and withdrew without accomplishing anything. This attack was made on the first day of the month Pamus, that is, Tammuz. When the Jews had retreated, The Romans brought up their engines, even though stones were thrown at them the whole time from the Tower of Antonia, and they were attacked with fire, swords, and every kind of missile that necessity allowed the Jews to use. Although the Jews depended greatly on their own wall and despised the Roman engines, they still tried to prevent the Romans from bringing them up. The Romans, on the other hand, struggled hard to bring them forward, believing that the Jews were so zealous because they wanted to prevent any impression from being made on the Tower of Antonia, whose wall was weak and whose foundations were rotten. Even so, the tower did not yield to the blows of the engines. The Romans endured the continual impact of the enemy's missiles from above and did not give way before any of the dangers that came down upon them, and so they brought their engines into position. But because they were below the enemy, and were badly wounded by the stones thrown down on them, some of them held their shields over their bodies. Then, partly with their hands, partly with their bodies, and partly with crows, they undermined the foundations. With great labor they removed 4 of the stones. Night then came upon both sides, and ended the struggle for the time being. However, during that night the wall was so shaken by the battering rams at the place where John had previously used his stratagem and undermined their banks that the ground gave way, and the wall suddenly fell. When this happened unexpectedly, the minds of the 2 sides were affected in different ways. One might have expected the Jews to be discouraged, since the fall of their wall had come unexpectedly, and they had made no provision for it. Yet they recovered their courage because the Tower of Antonia itself was still standing. The Romans' unexpected joy at the fall of the wall was quickly quenched when they saw another wall, which John and his party had built inside it. Still, the attack on the second wall appeared easier than the attack on the first, because it seemed much easier to reach it through the parts of the former wall that had now fallen. This new wall also appeared much weaker than the Tower of Antonia. Accordingly, the Romans imagined that, since it had been erected so suddenly, they would soon overthrow it. Yet no one ventured to go up to this wall, because anyone who was first to make the attempt would certainly be killed. Titus now considered that soldiers are stirred to eagerness in war chiefly by hope and by encouraging words, and that exhortations and promises often make men forget the dangers they face, and sometimes even despise death itself. So he gathered the bravest part of his army and tried what he could accomplish with them by these means. Fellow soldiers, to urge men to do something that involves no danger is, for that very reason, dishonorable to those being urged, and in the man who gives such an exhortation, it is also proof of his own cowardice. I therefore think exhortations should be used only when affairs are dangerous, and yet worthy for each man to attempt for himself. Accordingly, I entirely agree with you that going up this wall is a difficult task. But those who desire a reputation for valor should struggle with difficulties. This will become clear when I show in particular that it is a noble thing to die with glory, and that the courage needed here will not go unrewarded in those who first begin the attempt. Let my first argument be taken from what some might think a reasonable ground for discouraging you: the constancy and endurance of these Jews, even under their failures. It is unbecoming for you, who are Romans and my soldiers, who have been taught in peace how to make war, and who have also been accustomed to conquering in war, to be inferior to Jews either in the work of your hands or in courage of soul, especially now, when you are at the very end of victory and are assisted by God himself. Our misfortunes have been due to the madness of the Jews, while their sufferings have been due to your valor and to the assistance God has given you. Their seditions, the famine they are enduring, the siege they now suffer, and the fall of their walls without our engines, what can all these be except demonstrations of God's anger against them and of his help given to us? It is therefore not proper for you either to show yourselves inferior to those whom you are in fact superior to, or to betray the divine assistance that is being given you. Indeed, how can it be considered anything but base and unworthy that the Jews, who need not be greatly ashamed if they are deserted, since they have long learned to be slaves to others, nevertheless despise death, so that they may no longer be slaves, and frequently make sallies into the very midst of us, not in hopes of conquering us, but merely to demonstrate their courage, while we, who have taken possession of almost all the world that belongs either to land or sea, and for whom it will be a great shame if we do not conquer them, do not once undertake any dangerous attempt against our enemies, but sit idle with such brave arms as we possess, waiting only until famine and fortune do our work for us, even though with some small hazard we have it in our power to gain everything we desire. If we go up to this Tower of Antonia, we gain the city. If there should still be any need to fight against those within the city, though I do not suppose there will be, since we shall then be on the top of the hill and upon our enemies before they can recover breath, these advantages promise nothing less than a certain and sudden victory. As for myself, I will for now pass over any praise of those who die in war, and I will omit speaking of the immortality of men slain in the midst of martial bravery. Yet I cannot refrain from calling down this curse on men of the opposite disposition. May they die in time of peace by some disease or other, since their souls are condemned to the grave together with their bodies. For what virtuous man does not know that souls separated from their fleshly bodies in battle by the sword are received by the ether, that purest of elements, and joined to the company placed among the stars, that they become good demons and favorable heroes, and afterwards show themselves as such to their posterity? But upon those souls that waste away and with diseased bodies, a subterranean night comes to dissolve them into nothing, and deep oblivion comes to take away every remembrance of them, even if they have been clean from all the spots and defilements of this world. In such a case, the soul reaches at the same time the farthest limit of its life, of its body, and of its memorial. But since God has determined that death must necessarily come upon all men, a sword is a better instrument for that purpose than any disease whatever. Why, then, is it not a very mean thing for us not to give up for the public benefit what we must give up to fate? I have made this speech on the assumption that those who first attempt to go up this wall must necessarily be killed in the attempt, although men of true courage still have a chance to escape even in the most hazardous undertakings. In the first place, the part of the former wall that has been thrown down is easy to climb, and as for the newly built wall, it is easily destroyed. Therefore let many of you summon your courage and set yourselves to this work. Encourage and assist one another, and your bravery will soon break the hearts of your enemies. Perhaps such a glorious undertaking as yours may be accomplished without bloodshed. Although it may fairly be supposed that the Jews will try to hinder you when you first begin to climb up to them, yet once you have concealed yourselves from them and driven them away by force, they will not be able to endure your efforts against them any longer, even if only a few of you get ahead of them and pass over the wall. As for the man who first mounts the wall, I would blush with shame if I did not make others envy him by the rewards I would give him. If such a man escapes with his life, he shall have command over others who are now only his equals, though it is also true that the greatest rewards will come to those who die in the attempt. After this speech of Titus, the rest of the multitude were frightened by so great a danger. But there was one man named Sabinus, a soldier serving among the cohorts and a Syrian by birth, who showed very great strength of spirit, both by the deeds he had already done and by the courage of soul he displayed. Before he set himself to the work, anyone would have thought that his body was so weak that he was not fit to be a soldier. His complexion was dark, his flesh was lean and thin, and it clung closely to him. Yet a certain heroic soul lived in that small body, a body much too narrow for the extraordinary courage within him. Accordingly, he was the first to rise. I freely surrender myself to you, O Caesar. I will be the first to climb the wall, and I sincerely wish that my fortune may follow my courage and my resolution. But if some ill fortune grudges me the success of my undertaking, know that my failure will not be unexpected, and that I choose death willingly for your sake. When Sabinus had said this, he spread his shield over his head with his left hand, drew his sword with his right, and marched up to the wall at about the 6th hour of the day. 11 others followed him, and no more, resolved to imitate his bravery. Still Sabinus was the chief among them, and went first, as if driven by a divine fury. Those who guarded the wall shot at them from above and hurled countless darts at them from every side. They also rolled very large stones down upon them, which knocked down some of the 11 who were with him. But Sabinus himself met the darts thrown at him, and though he was overwhelmed with them, he did not slacken the force of his attack until he had reached the top of the wall and put the enemy to flight. The Jews were astonished at his great strength and the bravery of his soul, and because they imagined that more Romans had climbed the wall than actually had, they fled. Here one cannot help complaining of fortune, as if it is always envious of virtue, and always prevents the completion of glorious achievements. So it was with this man, just when he had attained his purpose. He stumbled on a certain large stone, and fell headlong upon it with a very loud noise. At this the Jews turned back. When they saw that he was alone, and that he had also fallen, they threw darts at him from every side. Nevertheless he rose on to his knee, covered himself with his shield, and at first defended himself against them, wounding many who came near him. But soon, because of the many wounds he had received, he was forced to relax his right hand, until at last he was completely covered with darts before he gave up the ghost. He was a man who, because of his bravery, deserved a better fate, but as might be expected, he fell under so immense an undertaking. As for the rest of his companions, the Jews smashed 3 of them to pieces with stones, and killed them after they had reached the top of the wall. The other 8, being wounded, were pulled down and carried back to the camp. These things were done on the 3rd day of the month Panis, that is, Tammuz. 2 days later, 12 of the men who were in the front ranks and kept watch upon the banks gathered together. They called to them the standard bearer of the 5th Legion, 2 other men from a troop of horsemen, and 1 trumpeter. About the 9th hour of the night, they went silently through the ruins to the Tower of Antonia. When they had cut the throats of the first guards of the place, who were asleep, they took possession of the wall and ordered the trumpeter to sound his trumpet. The rest of the guards suddenly got up and ran away before anyone could see how many men had climbed up. Partly from the fear they felt, and partly from the sound of the trumpet they heard, they imagined that a great number of the enemy had climbed up. As soon as Caesar heard the signal, he ordered the army to put on their armor at once, and he came there with his commanders. He was the first of all to ascend, along with the chosen men who were with him. As the Jews fled toward the temple, they fell into the mine that John had dug under the Roman banks. Then the seditious from both bodies of the Jewish army, both those belonging to John and those belonging to Simon, drove the Romans back. Indeed, they showed no lack at all of the highest degree of force and eagerness. They considered themselves utterly ruined if the Romans once got into the temple, while the Romans regarded the same event as the beginning of their complete conquest. A terrible battle was therefore fought at the entrance of the temple. The Romans forced their way forward, trying to take possession of that temple, while the Jews drove them back toward the Tower of Antonia. In this battle, darts were useless on both sides, and so were spears. Both sides drew their swords and fought hand to hand. During this struggle, the positions of the men on both sides could not be distinguished. They fought at random, mingled with one another, and thrown into confusion because the place was so narrow. The noise that reached the ear was indistinct because it was so extremely loud. Great slaughter was now made on both sides. Combatants trampled on the bodies and the armor of the dead and crushed them to pieces. Whichever way the battle inclined, those who had the advantage urged one another to press on, while those who were being beaten made loud lamentation. Still there was no room either for flight or for pursuit, but only disorderly turns and retreats, while the armies were mixed together. Those in the front ranks were under the necessity of killing or being killed, with no way to escape, for on both sides, those who came behind forced those before them onward, leaving no space between the armies. At length the Jews' violent zeal proved too much for the Romans' skill, and the battle was already turning entirely in their favor. The fight had lasted from the 9th hour of the night until the 7th hour of the day. The Jews came on in crowds, with the danger threatening the temple as their motive. The Romans, by contrast, had only part of their army there, for the legions on which the soldiers on that side depended had not yet come up to them. So, for the present, the Romans thought it enough to take possession of the Tower of Antonia. There was a man named Julian, a centurion from Bithynia, who had a great reputation. I had seen him earlier in that war, and he was among the most famous men for his skill in warfare, his bodily strength, and the courage of his soul. When this man saw the Romans giving ground, and in a miserable condition, for he was standing beside Titus at the Tower of Antonia, he leaped out, and by himself alone, put the Jews to flight, even though they were already winning. He drove them back as far as the corner of the inner court of the temple. The multitude fled from him in crowds, because they supposed that neither his strength nor the violence of his attacks could belong to a mere man. Accordingly, Julian rushed through the middle of the Jews while they were scattered in every direction, and he killed those he caught. Indeed, no sight appeared more wonderful in the eyes of Caesar, or more terrible to others than this. Yet he himself was pursued by fate, which it was impossible for him, being only a mortal man, to escape. His shoes, like those of every other soldier, were full of thick, sharp nails. As he ran on the pavement of the temple, he slipped and fell down on his back with a very loud noise from his armor. This made those who had been running away turn back. At the same time, the Romans in the Tower of Antonia gave a great shout, because they feared for the man. The Jews crowded around Julian and struck at him from every side with their spears and swords. He received many blows from these iron weapons on his shield, and he often tried to rise again, but those who struck him threw him down. Yet even as he lay stretched out on the ground, he stabbed many of them with his sword. He was not killed quickly, because his helmet and breastplate covered all the parts of his body where he might have been mortally wounded. He also drew his neck close to his body, until all his other limbs were shattered, and no one dared come to defend him. Then he yielded to his fate. Caesar was deeply moved because of this man of such great fortitude, especially because Julian was killed in the sight of so many people. Caesar wanted to come to his aid himself, but the place did not allow him to do so, while those who could have helped were too terrified to attempt it. Thus Julian struggled with death for a long time, and he allowed only a few of those who had given him his mortal wound to leave unhurt. At last, though not without some difficulty, his throat was cut. He left behind him a very great reputation, not only among the Romans and with Caesar himself, but also among his enemies. Then the Jews seized Julian's dead body, put the Romans to flight again, and shut them up in the Tower of Antonia. Those who most distinguished themselves and fought most zealously on the Jewish side in this battle were Alexis and Gythius from John's party, from Simon's party Malatius, Judas the son of Murdo, and James the son of Sosas, the commander of the Idumeans, and from the Zealots, 2 brothers, Simon and Judas, the sons of Jairus.
And there we will pause, with Antonia all but in Roman hands and the temple itself now exposed to the assault. Next time, in part 29, the tower is thrown down, Josephus pleads with his own countrymen one last time, the daily sacrifice fails for want of men to offer it, and the famine reaches its uttermost horror in the house of a woman named Mary. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.